It's interesting that, well, first of all, I applaud you for using clay. I think that's the right move. And not only did you use clay in your final model, but you also used clay for your exploratory kind of process models, concept models. The notion of the philosophy of minimalism versus deconstructivism, I'm not quite sure exactly what you ended up with, but this sort of cluster transition seems to be, you know, the philosophy that permeates through all of this. And you mentioned too his sense of privacy, and all of the spaces that you described in this kind of cave are more private. I mean, are there public galleries or no? Okay, that's important for you to mention, because you spent a lot of time on that originally, which describing that, which is important, but describing how that translates to the final design for this building is that's an important fact, is that it's really not a gallery where people are going to come look at his artwork.
It was more of his private domicile.
Yeah, so one notion is, okay, are there archives associated with this? Or, though I'm sure that Dr. Seuss's archives are pretty vast and they would not fit in here. But what's interesting about Dr. Seuss is that he was an artist in word and also in graphic art. And his poetry, I guess, if you'd call it poetry, right? So much rhythm and repetition, etc., is a form of art. And that does factor into everything that you've talked about. And his imagery that you captured here, you know, especially when it comes to references toward an architectural reference of some sort, the arches, the fact that you have these winding paths up a hillside. This is floating in midair, and some of these are just, you know, kind of on a hillside, but then you've got this mountain, and you're connecting, you know, one side to another. So when it comes to defining the topography, you know, it's one question I have. You put so much thought into everything else that I'd be interested, again, for you to think more about why is your topography like this? You know, why, when you're doing something that's so connective, you're really just doing a hill. You know, you're not doing two mounds where you're leaping from one to the other. You're just doing one. And it's clear with looking at all of these levels, again, you know, you have some repeated images. It's interesting that, you know, he has this fantasy, and graphic fantasy, and that instead of you know, focusing on this sort of mousetrap kind of stacked, you know, the game mousetrap thing, that you're really focusing more on the organic.
Which I like. I just have one thing to say. Okay, this is on my mind. If I look at this from way back there, I'm so glad you mentioned the word organic quite a few times, because it really holds up from 20 feet back. It looks like an organic piece. You know, this, like, you know, very, very cool. The one thing that I would say from a constructive criticism as you pursue it, or as you think as you go into sophomore studio, it's 4 or 5 floors. You're really the only person that has sort of a taller scheme, and you have a relatively mundane, straightforward pancake section. No, hear me out. So the point being is that I like this space, but I would have loved to have seen breaks where you have 5-story spaces, 4-story spaces, shafts of light coming down through. It's interesting the way that you articulated and denoted a basement, because that's very pragmatic. You know, I'd rather have you think about it being a castle to a certain degree, but an abstract organic plant or something. So the only thing I'm saying, boom, 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 boom. So you do have some very interesting spaces, but how light penetrates down through, this doesn't feel organic.
Yeah.
Like if Zaha was doing this or somebody, you know, she would start to have the curved walls come through, so the whole piece would be coming through.
Yeah.
So I think it's beautifully done, and I love it, but it feels a little bit more, and I really like the floor plans, but it feels a little bit more successful from an exterior, positive, negative. You know how you talked about how it's a block and then you erode through, like Stephen Hall or something like that? But I think you're missing an opportunity to have, these work pretty well. So some of them work. So I think maybe it's just where you decided to pancake, you may start to open that up a bit more.
Yeah, it's also where you cut your sections, because you do have this as a
That's a good
3-story
point.
space right here, and
Maybe
so
cut the sections in the wrong spot.
your sections would be transformed by removing these floors here and showing the central courtyard as a unifying element, as a spatial element. And you did talk about the light coming in through the center, right? And
I was
permeating the space.
trying to show those more in my renderings. I was trying to kind of,
Yeah, but your sections are
Yeah.
important too. The other thing too that I think is highly important is this lower level right here. This is the lowest level, right? So, you know, like Franz Klein over here, you know, this is all a mountain. This is all part of the hill. This should all be red.
oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, so when you look at the plan that you're cut through at this lower level, and you know this isn't just a thin wall; it's the whole hillside. That starts to be exciting architecturally, and then you can see how it's carved out of the hill. So you talk about, you know, your positive and negative spaces, how subtractive, right? You talk about subtractive, positive, negative arches, a cluster transition, and then navigating this flow. So you're showing this navigation ramp, and then it gets cut off as you go through the different levels. So in diagrams, you know, when you have all of these different plans here, you get a better sense of that flow and the ramp and the open space, you know, in here, this courtyard.
Yeah.
So, but you're still in the hill here. So where does the hill really start to become exposed in the section? And you have to find that point at each level.
Yeah,
So-
I've got to speak up. So the thing is, you know, we have 20 more minutes we're not even halfway through. So
Okay.
you wanted to get going. No,